Hello, I'm Steve Hemmond from the Massachusetts Association of Regional Schools, MARS. As part of our professional development program, we are producing video clips that present different aspects about the operation of a regional school district from the viewpoint of school committee members, superintendent, business administrators, and staff. This program is entitled Managing the Budget, presenting budget reports in a timely manner. For this program, we have Stacy Jackson and Julie Kelly. Stacy is a former member of the Wachusett Regional School District Committee, and Julie is also a former member of the Wachusett School Committee. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Stacy Jackson and Julie Kelly.
Thank you, Steve. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the school committee is responsible for managing the budget, and the best way to do that is to get consistent, timely budget reports. And those budget reports need to be presented to you in a way that you completely understand the budget, you can make decisions, and you can help the superintendent and the business manager manage that budget. So next slide, please. There's a number of different report types that you can receive, and it's really a matter of what the school committee is comfortable with. And honestly, anything that the school committee is asking for in terms of managing the budget, they should receive in a timely manner. If you're asking for information from your superintendent or your business manager and you're getting some pushback, that needs to be worked out at the school committee level, because again, ultimately, school committee is responsible for that budget. So school committee needs access to any documents to make decisions and help monitor that budget. So a number of different report types, and again, it's different district to district. It is very much based kind of on the school committee's personal, the way they want to receive the information, and also how it's presented by their superintendent or business manager. Some report types include a list of grants, a list of revolving accounts, and that will include the balances, seeing what's going into the account as well as what's coming out of the account. Any other special funds. Circuit breaker money, you should have a really good accounting of what's going on in circuit breaker, how much reimbursement you're getting back. Your school choice, both outgoing expenses as well as incoming revenue with regard to school choice. Your E&D is excess and deficiency funds. That's kind of called the rainy day account. That's the account that any surplus at the end of the year will close out to. And then those funds could be used with school committee authorization to be used to offset the following year's budget or for any extraneous expenditures that you might have. And also a stabilization account. Not every account or not every district will have a stabilization account, but if they do, you as a school committee member should know what's in that account and what could potentially be going out of the account. Next slide, please. So again, these reports can be presented in a number of different ways. Again, the information needs to get to school committee so that school committee can make good decisions. So you need to be asking for these reports, and if a report is presented in a way that it's not clear to you, you need to ask more questions. You need to get information, because you should never be sitting at the table of school committee not knowing what's going on, especially with your budget. That is one of your most important priorities. So in terms of totals, you can look at income, budget expenditures, and the balance. You should have a full picture of what's going on.
And I would like to add on that, particularly on the income, is you might want to have on that report exactly what you have received and what you anticipate and what's going to be the ending balance. And the budget expenditures, again, should have what you've expended, what you've obligated through purchase orders, maybe within what you think you're going to spend, and then where you're going to come out in the end result.
And that's a really good point that Steve makes, is all foreseeable expenditures and revenue coming in should be encumbered within your financial software package. If you're not encumbering things in there, then you really don't have a really good picture of what's going to happen and how the year might close out. So it is really important to make sure your business manager and his or her staff are encumbering things in there. Looking at income breakdown, income comes in through a wide variety of sources, and you should really have a good handle on all of those. The Chapter 70 money coming from the state, any local contributions, and these are monies, your assessments coming from your member towns, and those are going to be coming in at different intervals according to your regional agreement. So that's something you need to monitor, not only what's coming in, but when it's coming in as well. any interest earnings that your treasurer should be managing, any regional transportation reimbursement that's coming from the state, and then the assessments coming from the member towns, any tuitions, and any other sources of income. And then also keeping a close eye on the separate accounting for school choice and circuit breaker, revolving accounts, things of that nature. Next slide, please. Should also be looking at budget expenditures by the legal lines or the major appropriation categories. And again, these are the 9 different categories, things like instructional supplies, buildings and maintenance, things like that you really need to keep a close eye on those expenditures. And if one particular line is going into deficit, school committee needs to know about that to be able to authorize transferring money to another legal line. So again, school committee is responsible for authorizing the transfer from one legal line to another. So school committee really needs to have a handle on why that particular appropriation category has gone into deficit. Detailed budget reports. Some school committees might want program budget reports as well if there's certain programs within the school that are underperforming or not performing to budget. The school committee really needs to ask some questions and get some accounting of why they might be going into deficit.
And I would add, what you need to make sure is that your chart of accounts, that the numbers that you put in, we have what we call different levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 levels, and you have to define the programs. Like you have to take a look at, you have the science program, your science program, the math, or you have shops in the vocational school districts, that you have to be able to define those lines. So it's important when you set up your chart of accounts that you take into account all of those.
And then the last one we've listed here is regional assessment status. And again, what money is coming in from the towns and when that money is coming in. All of that should be listed in your financial software so that you can keep a close eye on that. And also that helps you monitor cash flow, which we'll go into later on as well. Next slide, please. Now we want to go over, some of the key players in your central office in a regional district, and talk about what you should be expecting from each of these folks, and what kind of reports, what kind of information you should be getting, and the frequency that you should be getting this information. So the business manager, that's your key point within central office to get a lot of this budget, the budget information, and you should be requesting that through your business manager, but going through the superintendent. So with the business manager, no less than monthly, you should be getting a year-to-date expenditure update that provides you information on the budget appropriation for every line item, the amount expended that month, the total encumbrances, and what the balance is. So again, these are the major appropriation categories. It is certainly within your purview to ask for information on the subcategories, but at a minimum, you need information on the major appropriation categories, because again, it's up to school committee to authorize the transfer from one appropriation category to another. And also, no less than monthly, you should be getting a year-to-date monthly revenue update, both from state and local assessments. And if we go to the next slide, here's an example of some reports that you could get from your business manager. And the top part of this shows information that was put into an Excel spreadsheet. And it's perfectly acceptable for your business manager or anyone in your business office to give you information in an Excel spreadsheet. Sometimes they find Excel is a little easier to present information, to put into a PowerPoint and things like that. However, it is absolutely critical that all that information that's put into an Excel spreadsheet is also backed up with information that comes directly from your financial software, whether it's Munis or a different financial software. Anything that's presented to you in Excel or any other type of format absolutely needs to be backed up by information coming directly out of your financial software. If you were to take your Excel spreadsheet and give that to an auditor, they are not going to look at anything that comes out of Excel. They want to see everything that comes right out of the software. So it's critical to do that. Districts over the years have gotten into trouble where a simple error is made within Excel, and if people are building their budgets and basing their decisions based on that, they're doing it erroneously, and it could have have detrimental effects. So you need to double check anything that's presented to you. You also need a copy from the financial software as well. With state revenue, looking at this revenue example, state revenue is received at different times throughout the year. Chapter 70 in school choice, you're getting monthly, regional transportation twice a year, circuit breaker 4 times a year, and then again your local assessments are provided by terms that are justified in your regional agreement. So you need to have a real clear picture of what's going on with your revenue. And next slide, please. And here's an example of your expenditures. And again, you want to know what the budget is, anything that's encumbered in there, and then the year-end balance. And you need to look at how those major appropriation categories are running either in surplus or deficit. Because again, if they are running in deficit, a transfer might need to be authorized by school committee. And again, anything that's presented to you needs to be backed up with the financial software.
I would add, if you take a look at this expenditure part, there's 2 parts. The top part is showing you what you had, say, FY15, what you projected, and then F16, 17. And it's helpful to have different years so you take a look at and see how you're running, and it gives you some idea if there's some problems or issues that are taking place in your budgetary purposes. And the bottom part is what I talked about earlier, talks about the appropriation, what you spent, encumbrances, then available. And again, you should, if you know that you're going to spend something, you should put under the encumbrances, you should put a purchase order through to make sure that it's held so there's no, people don't think there's extra money there or money that they can spend. Or it tells you if you got a problem and you're tracking that. So you want to make sure that you don't want any surprises on June 30th.
Next slide, please. No less than quarterly, your business manager should be presenting chargeback requests to the school committee for approval. And these would be chargebacks to your grants and revolving accounts. You should, the business manager should, if they can and it's appropriate, make the charge directly to the grant and revolving accounts if the funds is available in those accounts, but sometimes they aren't, such as salaries for Title I teachers, or cafeteria account in your revolving accounts, athletic, sometimes the stipends for those staff, that would be paid for out of your general fund, and then you would charge that back when the funds became available. No less than quarterly, your business manager should be providing to the superintendent and school committee a list of revolving accounts and fiduciary accounts with each account's starting balances, revenue received to the account during that quarter, and the amount expended in ending balance. And it's important to remember, as we stated in the last presentation, that revolving accounts are not savings accounts. So money received into these accounts should be spent within the fiscal year, except for those few circumstances such as athletic accounts, because you're collecting fees for fall programs. So they will be in during the summer. Also, before the end of the fiscal year, for the following fiscal year, for the use in kindergarten tuition fees, things along that nature. So you will see those accounts end with considerable balances, but that's explainable. And if you're seeing a large balance, ask the question of your business manager and superintendent, why is there this balance, and are we collecting the correct amount of fees, or are we collecting too much? Another area that you need to remember is expenditures cannot be approved on your revolving accounts unless the funds are in the accounts to cover the expenditure. You cannot put your revolving account into a deficit. At the end of the year, all of those revolving accounts will be audited, and they need to all black out for a zero balance or a surplus. The only exemption to that is your cafeteria account, and I want you to be careful with your cafeteria account. If you're getting your updates quarterly from the business manager of your projections for your revolving accounts, you want to pay close attention to your cafeteria account, because that will throughout the year go into deficit, and it's allowed by DOR to be in deficit throughout the year, because it's partly dependent on federal funding, which comes at certain points during the year. What I think is a red flag for school committee members is when you're looking quarterly at your cafeteria account balances, and at the end of the year you see a large deficit, it could be a sign of the business office balancing their general budget by putting their cafeteria account into a larger deficit. So that's a red flag, and it requires a little bit more questions and investigation as to why did this throughout the year look okay, and at the end, we have a large deficit, because that wouldn't be appropriate to balance your general budget by putting a revolving account into deficit. Any deficits on your revolving account do need to be made up by your general fund, which DOR will make you do. Correct, Steve, and your E&D certification?
Yes, absolutely. You go through, and if you have a negative in any of those, they'll deduct it from your available E&D.
Next slide, please. Any and all activity between line items on the general budget and chargeback requires approval of the school committee prior to the chargeback. So you should not be getting requests for motions from the superintendent's office to approve a chargeback that occurred at the end of July that they did in June. You should be getting this before the chargeback is made. Any activity on the general fund between the major line items and between grants and revolving accounts require the approval of the school committee. That should be an audit finding if you're doing it after the fact. Any and all activity on the general budget to include transfers and chargebacks, federal grants are exempt from this because they have a longer fiscal year, must be completed by July 15th. That's a non-negotiable date established by law, which DOR will strictly adhere to if they're made aware of that you're making chargebacks after that June 30 or the July 15th deadline. They will reject any activity after July 15th, which will affect your E&D certification or really send it into possible deficit, as our district had experienced. Any and all expenditures made by the district requires warrant approval. Checks and deposits cannot be generated or leave the district unless the school committee has approved the warrant.
One of the things we're going to talk about is the treasurer, and what I wanted to make mention about that is very clear, and we'll make it again, but the fact is the treasurer cannot be the business manager cannot be the treasurer. That's by law, so they have to make a separation of powers and duties. And the treasurer reports directly to the school committee, is hired by the school committee. Though we do recommend at Mars that they should have in the description or the contract of the treasurer that the treasurer, the daily supervisor, is the superintendent to make sure that the job is being done. If the job is not being done, and then they report to the school committee, then they can take appropriate actions. But it's very important to have that separation of powers and duties. So, okay, we'll talk a little bit, the next slide, please, about the treasurer expectations.
So as Steve has stated, there should be a separation of duties, and all bank reconciliation should be done by the district treasurer and not the business office. The business office will absolutely conduct their own to make sure that their accounts are balancing, their general ledger is balancing. However, the treasurer should not be taking that and using that as their reconciliation. They need to be doing that on their own. So on occasion, you will see some districts, because by law, it's okay for a school committee member to be the treasurer, be appointed the treasurer. However, that is a tremendous responsibility. It's not something we recommend unless that school committee member has an accounting background and is capable of taking on the enormous responsibility of doing bank reconciliations by themselves. No less than once a month, the district treasurer should be providing to the school committee a reconciliation report which lists all the warrants paid that month, the resulting reconciled balances on all bank accounts, and any outstanding liabilities which are pending. This report is typically a couple months, 1 or 2 months delayed. You're not going to get July's report in August. You'll probably get that in September. In some districts, the treasurer likes to get the year-end June 30th closeout okayed by the auditors, which usually come in September, October frame before they start generating reports again, which is up to the school committee to accept or not, but they should be reconciling accounts every month. They just don't get that report to you until a month or two delayed.
One of the things I want to mention when you're doing the reconciliation and so forth between the treasurer and the business office is that you need to check, the treasurer will tell you how much cash they have and what accounts. You need to reconcile that with the accounting system, saying if we underspend our budget by $200,000, well, we should have $200,000 in the bank. Districts have to really make sure that they do that and check that to make sure that their budget reports on what they say are in the accounts matches to what's in the bank. Next slide, please.
So the treasurer is responsible for, after the school committee approves, of course, for obtaining revenue anticipation notes, which some districts require to ensure they have enough cash on hand in between their state and local assessment payments to meet payroll and other payment obligations. A regional school district functions as their own municipality, so this is an area of cash flow which standalone municipal districts don't typically deal with because they have the town treasurer take care of those things. So this is a very important area that school committee members typically don't know about, and they should, because you need to make sure you have enough cash on hand to meet your payroll and your invoice, AP warrant, payments, right? So on this is a cash reconciliation example. This is a treasurer's report that is received by the Wachusett Regional School District. Their treasurer lists the bank accounts, their ending balances, and any liabilities that are outstanding are noted at the bottom. Next slide, please. And on the first page of that report is all the payroll warrants that the treasurer paid that month, and the rates that the funds at the bottom are, the excess general funds are earning. Next slide, please. So the treasurer is responsible for developing, upon request, a cash flow statement, which is a projection of your anticipated monthly warrant payments and cash availability for the entire fiscal year. The creation of a cash flow sheet is a requirement of bond counsel to obtain approval for RAND purchasing. We highly recommend that you request a copy of the latest one completed for your district to familiarize yourself with the cash fluctuation, the district's accounters, and throughout the year, which is information you should be knowledgeable about to be in a position to approve your warrants, especially when you're coming up June 30th and you have accrued payroll that you need to cover throughout the summer that belong to the previous fiscal year. You should have enough cash on hand to cover that. So these are areas that you're looking out throughout the year. Some towns only pay their assessments twice a year, so that needs to be meticulous accounting by your treasurer and your business manager to make sure that you have enough cash on hand. This is very different from budget oversight. You're not overspending your budget, you just need the cash available to meet your payroll warrants and your AP warrants.
The other thing, just to interject here, the other area where cash flow becomes tremendously important is when you fail initially to set your budget and your district has to go into 1/12 budgeting. And you really have to monitor cash flow very, very carefully when you're on a 1/12 budget. And that could happen for some districts year after year, and it could go on for months and months. So that's another area where it's really important to really be on top of the cash flow to be able to manage that under a 1/12 budget.
One of the things I would add, the state has done on Chapter 70, which is a big chunk of money to the regions, is they used to do it quarterly, now they do it monthly, so that does help cash flow. But the biggest part, they got to look in June on cash flows, because a lot of times districts will have what we call checks, end of the year they get a lump sum check for teachers, and that they get that, and you got to make sure you got the money in the bank, because a lot of times they're paid before June 30th. So you have to really watch that to make sure that that cash flow will be there to do that. And again, if they have to, then there's a whole process they got to go through for borrowing.
The treasurer should provide warrant signing training to any member of the school committee upon request. The treasurer is ultimately responsible for those warrants, that there's enough cash on hand to cover them, but the actual warrants themselves, the AP for invoices and the payroll warrants, the treasurer can very easily explain to the school committee member, and you're also applying that separation of duty from the business manager to the treasurer. The treasurer is required to complete a year-end cash statement, which is filed with your paperwork to DOR for your E&D certification. This is due by October 31st of every year. Failure to file this can withhold your Chapter 70 payments. And the school committee should receive a copy of this documentation every year. And unfortunately, most school districts do not share that with their school committee. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here's an example of a cash flow analysis flow statement that our district treasurer in Wachusett had completed. As you can see, it gives you month, what payroll is, the anticipated payroll, and AP warrants that they plan on having to appropriate and what the ending balance for cash should be. Next slide, please. And this is an E&D analysis form that DOR certifies for your E&D, which Steve is a far more bigger expert on than I am, if you want to talk about.
Well, the E&D analysis, you've got these forms that the Department of Revenue will provide you. You have to fill them in. You have to have your balance sheets. You have to present it in. And it's important that they certify it, and you're going to get it in as soon as you can by the October 31st date. If you wanted to use, you can't use E&D until it's been certified. So that's where you have to be very careful to get the documents in, and then you can use that if you have to during the year. It also then becomes a funding source for your next year's budget as well. So you want to be very careful when you're doing that to those calculations, and also let your school committee see what the E&D calculations are. The Department of Revenue will send that when it's finished out. You'll send it to the superintendent as well as your member towns, and the school committee should see that as well. It becomes, in the fall, you get the answer, how much it is, and then you will be using that as a funding source in your next year's budget.
I recall one year finding out about this E&D process from a town selectman, because he posted on Facebook what our E&D balance was. It was negative that year, and we hadn't had any idea. It was filed in the paperwork that was received back from DOR. You don't want that to happen.
Like anything in your central office, there should be a clear separation of duties, and that applies to human resources and specifically with payroll. You should have one person setting the salaries directly into your financial software, and a different person, your payroll clerk, should not be able to change that. If your district is small and that's not feasible to have two different people within your HR payroll accounting office, then the HR staff should at least quarterly run a check of payroll to make sure that the salaries are accurate. Also, when those salaries are being set up, withholding accounts need to be set up for benefits. And with those withholding accounts, that's the health insurance premiums, any flex accounts, anything like that. There should be a reporting to school committee to make sure that those are balancing out. And those should be at least a couple times a year. You need to ask the questions of, are the withholding accounts balancing out? Because they should. And if they are in deficit, then you're going to have to make that up somewhere, and that's not a situation you want to be in. The HR director is also responsible for providing the superintendent or school committee a list of anticipated retirements throughout the year. As you know, there could be significant savings with a teacher that's at your top step retiring and bringing someone new on of a lower salary. That information needs to be known by school committee because that's going to affect the budget. So that's something that you need to be aware of. The HR director with the business manager also typically provides information when you're negotiating with your different unions, looking at different salary tables and how the benefits are going to project out. That's very important to the negotiating team. So that's an area where your HR director is going to be supporting those areas as well. And the school committee should receive an updated benefits projection after every open enrollment. You have open enrollments where you're offering benefits. You take an estimated guess about how many employees are going to take you up on taking part of those benefits, and those benefits are a very substantial cost to the district. So whatever changes happen after that open enrollment need to come and be reflected back to school committee, because that could, in a lot of cases, sway your budget, either up or down for that benefits appropriation category, and that might be something that could warrant a budget transfer in those appropriation categories at some point. One of the other things that school committee should be looking over at regular intervals is a list of employees, and make sure that there aren't employees that are still on the books that are phantom employees. They may have retired, they may have gone out on medical leave, long-term disability, and things like that. You need to make sure that you have an active list of active employees that are on there.
And I would add that a school district, some regional school districts are pretty small, You do need to assign somebody within that district who's going to do HR purposes, who's business manager, so that they have those items are done. And when you're very small, it's difficult, and sometimes people have multiple jobs, but you need to define what those areas are and what they're going to do and what they're going to calculate with that. The other issue of, when you do payroll, one of the big things that you have to do is usually at June comes, and then who's off, you make sure they take off the payroll, and then before you do it, when you're doing the first payroll, you can run a check. Usually they can do a pre-check, and you make sure people that have left are not on the payroll. And so the HR people have to make sure that when someone leaves, that the payroll people are notified they have left. And on top of that, you need to notify your technology people so that their privileges in the system of email, et cetera, is taken out. So you've got to have the communications to know both when someone comes in and when someone leaves, between HR and payroll and between the technology.
Next slide, please. With the Administrator of Special Education, the school committee is an appointing authority for this position. And a couple of the important roles that the Administrator of Special Education plays is they are responsible for claims made for circuit breaker and Medicaid. And these are very complex systems, so when you are interviewing a new potential Administrator of Special Education, you really need to ask that person about their experience with those claims system. It's very important to make sure that you are receiving the maximum allowable benefit through those claims, and make sure that those claims are filed appropriately. So that's a really important role for your Administrator of Special Education that you need to be aware of as a school committee member. One of the other areas that you really need to keep a close eye on is your out-of-district tuitions for students that the district is unable to service their needs with their in-district programs. They are sent to out-of-district placements. These placements are typically very costly, both for the tuition as well as for the transportation to go there. And there are students that need to go out of district, but if you're seeing a tremendous rise in the amount of students going out, or the tuition and transportation costs to send those students out, you need to be asking the tough questions of where are we failing in district to provide services? Because in some cases, for some students, if you can improve your programs in district, you would not have to send the kids out of district. So that's something you need to keep a close eye on. You also, as a school committee member, you need to monitor the legal costs associated with special education to make sure that the district is using mediations and hearings appropriately.
I do want to add on the Administrator for Special Education and also the School Business Administrator. In both cases, the school committee appoints them to that position, usually upon recommendation of the superintendent. Then the supervision of those two positions is by the superintendent, and if there's any non-renewal of those positions, that's done by the superintendent, not by the school committee. But the school committee, these are one of the few positions besides superintendent that the school committee does appoint. Yeah.
One of the other things to really keep an eye on with your Administrator of Special Education is looking at the budget projections for the following year, especially with those out-of-district tuitions. They will typically know which students are going to be aging out at either age 18 or age 22. And also they usually have a handle on what students are coming in to your preschool program, or students that might be in the process of going out of district. So that information needs to be worked out with your Administrator of Special Ed in terms of budgeting for the following year, is really looking forward and seeing what students you have not only this year, but how that's going to impact you next year. And any out-of-district placements, if their tuition rates are going up, that needs to be reflected in your budget as well. Next slide, please. And your buildings and grounds manager, that's another area that you need to closely monitor. Operations and maintenance costs can really spiral if those aren't monitored well. These are costs that, all buildings need a lot of maintenance, so you really need to keep an eye on which projects you can do in a fiscal year. And that's going to change throughout the year potentially. If utility costs really skyrocket, then you're going to have less money available to do maintenance. So you need to take a look at that. And really make sure that everyone there is encumbering all the projects that they're looking to spend. Again, information could be kept on an Excel spreadsheet, but it really should be encumbered in your financial software package so that you can track that well. One area of potential cost savings that some districts have seen is hiring a full-time employee rather than continuing to spend a lot of money on contracted services, especially with some of those operations and maintenance costs. I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Well, first of all, I want to thank both Julie and Stacy for the production of this particular clip on budget reports. This is a longer one than we anticipated, but it's really important that school committees know what type of reports they should be looking at, what also the superintendent and business manager should be producing those reports, and then giving them at the school committee meeting. So everybody's monitoring. What you do not want to have is a big surprise toward the end of the year. You do every month you should be doing it, and then sometimes when you have to do transfers or chargebacks, whatever, maybe you can do those quarterly, but you keep monitoring monthly, because then all of a sudden then you can make some adjustments as you see that goes down as you go down the fiscal year. So I want to thank you very much, and this concludes our video clip on budget reports.